Who is Jesus? I have no idea who Jesus is.
I don't know if it exists, but I believe in him.
I think it's a person who lived ages ago.
Who is Jesus? He is the Son of God in the Christian faith.
Jesus for me is also a prophet.
He probably was just some fella who walked around with a beard and and a bottle of wine in his back pocket and switched the water with the wine a couple of times, and everyone loved him.
Jesus to me is somebody we got taught about in infants and junior school, really.
It's how many millions of people celebrating his birthday. No one celebrates my birthday like that, so surely he must have existed.
Jesus is my God.
He's someone that, I can relate to, I can pray to, I can talk to.
The Son of God, but apparently we are all God's children. So then what is so great about Jesus?
I was born and bred in a beautiful little town just north of London called Luton. And I always feel like I have to apologize for that. And I think it's because Luton is one of those places which at first glance has very few redeeming features. But let me tell you, I lived there for 22 years. And when you scratch beneath the surface, it's got none, actually. But it's my hometown. I love it. I'm very fond of it. And I think Luton is just one of those places which at first glance, it's just you have to look a little bit harder to see the beauty in that town. So here's the view from the house I grew up in. There it is, and it might look like just a normal corner shop with like bollards to stop ram raids, and that is why they're there. But someone's gone to the trouble to paint them that lovely shade of green, and it kind of all matches with this kind of security shutters. She just has to look a bit closer, and my parents had been missionaries in China, and they returned to England before I was born. So kind of church and faith were part of my life from a really young age. And then I went to quite a rough high school. It was actually the worst school in Luton. It's quite a difficult accolade to achieve. And it's what these days you'd probably call a failing school, largely because it failed and they knocked it down. And in that school, I quite quickly realized that I was one of only 2 or 3 out of 800 people who had any kind of faith or went to church. And I suddenly realized you didn't have to believe this stuff that I've been brought up with. And at the same time, all my friends at church stopped coming to church. So I was forced to work out for myself what I actually believed about Jesus. There came a point where I had to make a decision on the evidence. Is all this stuff I've been brought up with true? Is it real? I couldn't just pretend to believe something that wasn't true, put my head in the sand and hope it was true. I couldn't take some kind of blind jump of faith. I needed some evidence. For me personally, evidence has always been really important. After Luton, I went to read law at Oxford. And in fact, I studied and worked as a lawyer for 10 years. I worked as a barrister specializing in defending people accused of crimes. And over the years, I defended hundreds, probably over 1,000 people accused of crimes. It's great to see so many of you here tonight. And but every case I worked on for years, the first question was always, what is the evidence? What are the facts about what happened? How does the evidence stack up? And when it comes to who Jesus is, I'm convinced by the evidence. But what evidence is there? Well, you can't prove Christianity mathematically. You can't prove it scientifically. Science, of course, answers the questions how and when. It doesn't answer the question who and why. So suppose I invited you over to my house this weekend, and we went into the kitchen, and the kettle was boiling. And you said to me, why is the kettle boiling? Now, I could say, well, the kettle's boiling because there's a heat source and there's a transfer of thermal energy across the container wall, passing, into the fluid and causing an increase in the mean square velocity of the temperature of the molecules proportionate to the temperature. And when that hits 100 degrees Celsius, there's a collective phase transition by which the condensed liquid expands into a gaseous state. I could say that. And that is an answer to the question. It tells you exactly what is happening. It tells you how it's happening. But it doesn't tell you who or why. I could say, the kettle's boiling because I wanted to make you a cup of tea. Because actually, I'd quite like to have a chat and get to know you. See, there are some things that only the Maker can reveal, actually. Science is so important, it reveals how things happen, but it doesn't tell us who and why. And the questions who and why are a matter of faith, actually. It takes as much faith to be an atheist as it does to be a Christian, because you can't prove that there is no God scientifically, just as you can't prove that there is a God scientifically. It's a matter of looking at the evidence. And I want to look at the historical evidence. Scientific evidence is not the only kind of evidence. For lawyers, historical evidence is highly important. That's what you put before a jury. The jury weren't witnesses to the events. They have to take, every time they bring in a verdict, they have to take a step of faith based on the evidence they've heard. And I myself could not be a Christian if it needed me to take a blind leap of faith without any evidence. For me, it's a question of taking a step of faith based on good historical evidence about the life, the death, and in particular, the resurrection of Jesus. But sometimes people say, well, hang on a second. I don't even believe there's a God. Why are we suddenly talking about Jesus? And I understand that it might kind of seem like putting the cart before the horse. But what I want to suggest is that if I want to know you, if I want to really know you, I can find out a little bit about you by watching you and looking at you and so on. But ultimately, I can only know you if you choose to reveal your true self to me, if you show a bit of who you really are. And it's the same with God. We can only really know God if he chooses to reveal himself to us. And the claim of the New Testament is that God has done that. And he's sort of done it in a way that you would expect or that makes sense. Because if God is going to reveal himself to us as human beings, what's the logical way to do that? It's to become a human being. And for me, it's actually the life, the death, and in particular the resurrection of Jesus that convinces me that this world has a creator and that that creator is to be viewed through the lens of Jesus. So what is the evidence? How do we know, for example, that Jesus even existed? Well, the answer is that we do know Jesus existed. There's overwhelming historical evidence that Jesus existed. First of all, outside the New Testament. The Roman historian Tacitus talks directly about Jesus. The Roman historian Suetonius talks indirectly about him. And the first century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus said this. He said, now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it's lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. And then he goes on to talk about his crucifixion and his alleged resurrection. So there's evidence outside the New Testament that Jesus existed, but more important, there's evidence inside the New Testament. You know, sometimes people say, well, the New Testament was written like a really long time ago. How do we know that what they wrote has not been changed over the years? And the answer is we do know very accurately through the study of textual criticism what the original writers wrote. And essentially the way it works is the more manuscripts we have and the closer in time they are to the original, the more certain we can be about the original. So here's a few examples in case this is your thing. For example, Herodotus and Thucydides were written in the 5th century BC. The earliest copy we have is AD 900. There's a 1300-year time gap, and we have 8 copies of each. And no classical scholar would doubt their authenticity. Tacitus, there's a 1,000-year gap, and we have 20 copies. Caesar's Gallic War, a 950-year gap. We've got 9 to 10 copies. Livy's Roman History, a 900-year gap, 20 copies. But when it comes to the New Testament, it is unique amongst ancient documents, both for the sheer number of manuscripts and their closeness in time to the original. So the New Testament was written between 40 and 100 AD. We have manuscript evidence as early as AD 130 and full manuscripts by AD 350. And we have 5,309 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin manuscripts, and 9,300 others. And that's why the classical scholar, F.J. Hort, who's an expert in these things, said this. He said, in the variety and fullness of the evidence on which it rests, the text of the New Testament stands absolutely and unapproachably alone amongst ancient prose writings. And again, no secular historian would disagree with that conclusion. So we know from evidence inside and outside the New Testament that he existed. But who is he? Well, we know he was fully human. He had a human body. He ate, he drank, he sweated, he got tired, he suffered pain. He had human emotions, love, joy, sadness. He had human experiences. He had the experience of growing up in a family, of education, of having a job, of being tempted, of bereavement, of suffering, being tortured. He had the experience, actually, of death. And many today would say, well, okay, he was a human being, but he was only a human being. Maybe he was a great religious teacher, but no more than that. So what evidence is there to suggest that Jesus was more than just a great religious teacher? Well, there are two parts to this argument, really, because the first part is, who did Jesus think he was? Because if Jesus didn't think he was any more than a human being, a great religious teacher, that is the end of the argument. And some people say, well, Jesus never claimed to be God, and it's true, he didn't go around wearing a t-shirt saying, I am God. But when you look at everything he said and he taught and did, I think there's little doubt he was conscious of being a man whose identity was God. And so that's the first part of the argument. And then secondly, was he right? What evidence is there to support his claims? So firstly, what did he say about himself? Well, the teaching of Jesus was centered on himself. You know, most great religious teachers, they point away from themselves. They say, oh, don't look at me, look at God. But Jesus, in pointing people to God, pointed them to himself. He said, it's through me you come into a relationship with God. And I don't know how you're doing tonight. I don't know if you've had a really tough year or a great year. I don't know if you feel like you're hanging on by your fingertips or if you feel like you're hitting home runs for fun. I don't know how you're doing, but I've experienced both sides of that. I've been through periods when actually I felt like I was doing really well. I had a great job, I was earning lots of money, had great holidays, a great life. I really loved my job. It was really fun working as a barrister. I mean, defending, people who run large criminal, people who are accused to run large criminal enterprises. That's fun. They're interesting, charismatic people. They're great people to spend the day with. It's interesting work. And plus, if you go to a party and you're a criminal barrister, people are instantly interested in what you do for a living. They're like really fascinated. That's fascinating. And the great thing was, I worked with some people who were completely at the top of their game. They were amazing at what they did. So if the person knew my sector, it was even better, because they'd be like, oh, you work with them? They're brilliant. You must be brilliant. And I'd be like, no. But inside I was thinking, yes. And so it was really fun. And I had lots of great stuff in my life. But even with all the things I had in my life, great things, I always seemed to want more. It was almost like I had some kind of spiritual hunger. And Jesus said, I'm the bread of life. If you come to me, that hunger will be satisfied. And actually, that's what I found. And then there's the stuff in my life I don't like the bad habits, the stuff I can find quite addictive. Like, I don't know, comparing yourself to others, or using Instagram. It's basically like the same thing. Or whatever it is for you. I love Instagram. I absolutely love Instagram. It's so much fun. It's a great way to connect. I really enjoy it. But there's that whole thing of like, no matter how good your day is going, you can always find someone else who's having a better day. No matter how fun your party is, there's always somewhere that will give you FOMO. It's like, oh, wow, you're in Mauritius. That's amazing. I'm so happy for you. And you're kind of scrolling up. And you can kind of keep scrolling until you either feel like superior or feel inferior. But the weird thing is you're kind of comparing your behind the scenes to everyone else's highlight reel. And, it's not just that. There's been other things. But Jesus said, if the Son sets you free, if Jesus sets you free, you'll be free indeed. And that's also my experience, that Jesus has set me free from all sorts of stuff. A bad temper, other stuff too. Some things straight away, sometimes it's been a longer process. And there's stuff like guilt, worry, anxiety, fear. I wonder if you've had the experience that I have of, like you make a mistake at work and it's actually a really bad mistake and people are really upset with you. Or you fall out with a friend and you can't quite see how the relationship is going to be repaired. And you find yourself waking up at 2 a.m. and kind of sitting up in bed in the dark and just kind of looking around and thinking, is it actually going to be okay? The worry kind of gets to you. And Jesus he says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest. You'll actually find peace. Jesus said, if you receive me, you receive God. If you welcome me, you welcome God. If you've seen me, you've seen God. And I don't know about you, we've all probably come across people who perhaps don't have a huge amount of modesty and seem to think that they're like God's gift to the world. Like you ask them what God looks like, they would think they only have to look in the mirror. You know, maybe you've got a boss like that, or an ex. But Jesus, who didn't have a trace of arrogance in his nature, said, if you want to know what God looks like, look at me. So first is his teaching centered on himself, but secondly, his indirect claims. Jesus put himself in a position which only God could be in. For example, Jesus said to people he'd never met before, like, your sins are forgiven. I mean, just imagine going up to someone on the tube tomorrow morning, just going, your sins are forgiven, your sins are forgiven. I mean, they'll be like, what are you on about? And they said that to him. You know, the lawyer said, wait a minute, to forgive those who've sinned against other people, that's something only God can do. Who do you think you are? And Jesus said, I've come to die for your sins, to make forgiveness possible. Right at the heart of Christianity is forgiveness. To be a Christian is to forgive the inexcusable in others because God has forgiven the inexcusable in me. And then the third piece of evidence is his direct claims, if you like. I don't have time to look at all of them, but we can just look at one. If someone says to you, Jesus never claimed to be God, and you only had time to show them one verse, show them this one. The background is that a claim tantamount to a claim to be God was considered blasphemy in the eyes of the religious leaders, and it was considered actually worthy of death by stoning. And Jesus says this in John 10:30. He says, I and the Father are one. Again, they picked up stones to stone him. Then Jesus said to them, look, I've shown you many great miracles from the Father. For which of these do you stone me? We're not stoning you for any of these, they replied, but for blasphemy, because you, a mere human being, claim to be God. Those who were around him, those who heard him and opposed him, said, you're claiming to be God. They were in no doubt about what Jesus was claiming, that he was God, and they said he deserved to die for it. So from his teaching, his direct and indirect claims, the evidence suggests that Jesus did claim to be God. Now, obviously, that's a remarkable claim, and it needs to be tested. But it seems to me there's three possibilities. The first is that it wasn't true, and Jesus knew it was untrue, in which case he was an imposter, he was a fraudster, and he's an evil one at that. Second possibility is it's not true, and he really didn't realize it. So he genuinely thought he was God, even though he wasn't. And we would call someone like that deluded or insane. But the only other logical possibility is that it's true. C.S. Lewis put it like this. He said, a man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said wouldn't be a great moral teacher. He'd either be insane or else he'd be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else he's insane or something worse. But don't let us come up with any patronizing nonsense about him being a great religious teacher. He hasn't left that open to us. He didn't intend to. So was Jesus right in what he claimed? What evidence is there to support what he said? Well, the first thing to look at is his teaching. The teaching of Jesus is widely acknowledged to be the greatest teaching of all time. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do to others what you would have them do to you. And then this, completely revolutionary. He was the first person to say it. Love your enemies. Jesus' teaching has been the foundation of really our entire civilization in the West. Many of our laws were originally based on the teaching of Jesus. And I think about this. We've advanced in every field of science. Just think about the technological achievements of the last 10 years. Brain implants, nanotechnology, Tinder. But in 2,000 years, no one has ever improved on the moral teaching of Jesus. They're the greatest words ever spoken. They're the sort of words you'd expect God to speak. And then his life, the things he did. He must have been the most extraordinary person to be around. People sometimes say, oh, is Christianity boring? It wouldn't have been boring being around Jesus. Imagine, I just want to imagine, you're facing a serious moral, ethical dilemma at work. You're not sure what to do. You've got one phone call. Which mate do you phone? Who's your kind of sensible, go-to mate, calm in a crisis, always wise, knows the right thing to do, could talk you down, they know the right thing to do. Just picture that person in your mind. And I want you to imagine that you've had great news at work. You maybe got a bonus or a promotion, or that person you like has kind of, smiled at you or something, And it's a Friday night. You want to go out on the town to celebrate. You want to hit it hard. And who's your go-to party friend? Always up for a night out. Just to picture those two people. Now, I don't know about for you. For me, they're two very different people. I would never want to get them muddled up. It could get very messy. I'd phone for ethical advice at work, and I'd end up in a club in Shoreditch at 4 a.m. It's not a good look. But the amazing thing is, Jesus the greatest moral teaching the world's ever seen, but he also went to a party. The wine ran out, so he says, you see those stone jars over there? Fill them up with 20 or 30 gallons of bath water and start pouring them out for the guests. And they did, and it was the best wine of the night. It might surprise you, Jesus is the guy who kept the party going. And not just his miracles, but his love for the loveless, his love for people who society had written off and excluded, and the way he sets people free and still sets people free today. And of course, I suppose, ultimately, his death, laying down his life for his friends. And then his character. The character of Jesus has impressed millions of people who wouldn't call themselves Christians. Time magazine said this: Jesus is the most persistent symbol of purity, selflessness, and love in the history of Western humanity. His enemies could find no fault with him, and his friends who knew him very well said this guy is without sin. As I'm sure you know, the real test of character is what we're like when we're seriously under pressure. You know, when you make a mistake at work and your boss is screaming at you, when things are going a bit sideways in a relationship, when a relationship we put all our hopes in breaks down and we wonder what's going to happen next, when we're really under pressure. And when Jesus was being tortured, he said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And then there's his fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. Jesus, no one else in the history of humanity has had a whole collection of books written about them before they were even born. Jesus fulfilled over 300 Old Testament prophecies spoken by different voices over hundreds of years, 29 of them in a single day. And someone might say, well, yeah, look, come on. Jesus read the Old Testament. Maybe he was a clever con man. He kind of read it and thought, oh, maybe I'll go out and do some of these prophecies, start something. But it doesn't work, not only because of the sheer number of them, but because there were many things over which he simply had no control. The prophecies about the exact manner of his death, the place of his burial, even about the place of his birth. I mean, imagine Jesus reading the Old Testament and saying, oh, I'm supposed to be born in Bethlehem. It's too late. But he was born in Bethlehem, something he had no control over. And then, by far the most important, his conquest of death. The physical resurrection from the dead of Jesus is the cornerstone of Christianity. And it's so relevant to every single one of us here. Every one of us is going to die. I feel a bit awkward bringing that up on Wednesday night in central London. But it's the ultimate statistic, isn't it? One of you is going to die. And you might have noticed that in the media, when a famous person dies, even in really tragic circumstances, the death is reported, and then quite quickly we kind of scoot on to talking about how amazing they are. It's like we can't even sit with the reality of death for more than a second. We don't like to talk about death. I even heard of a hospital where they've forbidden the use of the word death. They have a much more politically correct way of speaking about it. They talk about a negative patient care outcome. But the fact is we die. And I'll never forget going to the funeral of my good friend Jamie, who died in really tragic circumstances. And you kind of see his coffin, and it's going into the ground, and it looks so final. It looks like the end. And it is the end, unless death has been conquered. And that's the claim of the New Testament, that Jesus died and was buried, and on the third day he was raised to life. And that means it's possible for every one of us to have eternal life. And that is an extraordinary claim. It's the basis of hope at every funeral. But is it true? I mean, that's what really matters. Just because it's great to believe doesn't make it true. So why do I believe that Jesus rose from the dead? Well, I actually hadn't realized how much evidence there is for the physical resurrection of Jesus. And there are 4 reasons why I believe he rose from the dead. First of all, no one has ever really satisfactorily explained how Jesus' body was absent from the tomb on Easter Day. Some people say, well, maybe the authorities took the body. But that's not at all likely, because if they had the body, all they had to do when people are running around saying he's risen from the dead is say, no, he's not. We got him. Here he is. And that would have put an end to it. Others have said, well, maybe the disciples stole the body. And then they began a rumor that Jesus had been resurrected, but the tomb was guarded by Roman soldiers, sealed on the orders of Pilate. And it's also psychologically improbable. You've got this depressed, disillusioned group of people. Look what they had to go through for their beliefs. Why would the disciples have been willing to be tortured and die for something they would have known if they'd taken the body was a lie? Well, some say, well, maybe the robbers stole the body. But that's actually least likely of all, because I haven't actually talked about the empty tomb, because the tomb was not empty. Jesus' body was absent. But when the disciples got to the tomb, they found the grave clothes which were the only valuable thing, the only thing for the robbers to take. They had like collapsed like a caterpillar's cocoon after the butterfly has emerged. And the headpiece that had been around Jesus' head had been folded up and put in a separate place. And when they saw that, they believed. And the second reason I believe Jesus rose from the dead is not only was Jesus absent from the tomb, he was present with people. He was seen by many people on different occasions. And sometimes people say, well, is that hallucination? And yeah, some people do hallucinate. Kind of people who hallucinate, highly strung, imaginative people, some people who have had quite a lot of drugs. But among Jesus' disciples, you had Thomas, the ultimate skeptic. You had tough, gritty fishermen. You had Matthew, the tax collector. Tax collectors do not hallucinate. But in any event, it's highly unlikely that even two people would have the same hallucination. Jesus appeared on 11 separate occasions, on one occasion to more than 500 people at the same time. 500 people could not have the same hallucination. And then the third reason is the immediate impact. Here are a group of people who were discouraged, depressed, fearful, hiding. And then something happened that totally changed them so that 3 days after his death, they were going around telling everyone, we've seen Jesus. Jesus is alive. And then you get this historical phenomenon we know about, which is the birth and growth of the Christian church. And it's an extraordinary phenomenon because beginning with basically a group of fishermen and tax collectors, there is this explosion in 300 years right across the whole known world. It's a story of peaceful revolution without parallel, really, in the history of the world. And then the fourth reason I believe Jesus rose from the dead is the sheer number of people's lives who have been transformed by Jesus. More people today than ever before. Tens of thousands of people each day are placing their trust in Jesus. Today, 2,300 million people are Christians in the world, all testifying to an experience of Jesus and an encounter with Jesus. We've got Christian experience down the ages, countless millions of people who've experienced the risen Jesus Christ. And it's people of every ethnicity, every nationality, every continent, every economic, social, intellectual background, from all walks of life, uniting in this common experience of the risen Jesus. So when I look at Jesus' claims, what he said about himself, who he said he was, his teaching, his life, his fulfillment of prophecy, his resurrection from the dead, to say he was evil or deluded, it just seems unbelievable and illogical. So I'm left with the only other option. When I look at the evidence, it gives the strongest possible support to Jesus being a man whose identity was God. But there is all the difference in the world between head knowledge and heart knowledge. I can be convinced of something in my head without it making its way to my heart. And when I placed my trust in Jesus, that knowledge made its way from my head to my heart. And Jesus said, I've come so you might have life, and life in all its fullness. And I've had my ups and downs. I've been through difficulties. I've messed up more times than I care to remember. I am far from perfect. But I've experienced what Jesus promised. It really is true that God has revealed himself in Jesus. Jesus really is who he claimed to be. Jesus really did rise from the dead. There is hope beyond this life. There is hope for this life. Right now, in an encounter with Jesus, we find life and life in all its fullness. That's my experience of what Jesus came to bring. And that's why I believe he is who he claimed to be. Thank you so much for listening. Now it's time for coffee and small groups.